In this video, we're going to discuss AWS accounts. Accounts are fundamental components in AWS for managing identities and policies. In conceptual terms, you can think of an AWS account as encompassing an identity, be it a human identity, such as your own personal account or the accounts that represent your employees, or a service identity, such as an account that's used to represent an application. But your account is more than just an identity. It also encompasses all the AWS resources, data, and access management policies that are associated with that identity. For example, your account may have an AWS S3 bucket and data, as well as policies for how others can access that bucket and that data. By default, accounts are permission isolated, meaning other accounts don't have access to your account's resources and data unless you explicitly grant permission through policies. Large organizations don't typically contain a loose collection of accounts. Instead, their accounts are organized. In AWS, these organizational units are managed via a service called AWS Organizations. This sort of management service is required since the interplay between accounts can be complex and difficult to manage and maintain in a company. So the AWS Organizations service empowers you to organize all your various AWS accounts into meaningful organizational units, or OUs, in a hierarchy. Then you can manage them in groups instead of individually, and you can also see your billing reports in groups rather than in disparate reports of accounts. This greatly simplifies account management at scale. Another service we haven't talked about yet that's crucial for managing large account structures is AWS Control Tower. As we will see in the coming slides, AWS Control Tower works with AWS organizations to extend controlled management of multiple AWS accounts. So let's review what AWS Organizations has to offer. As briefly touched on, AWS Organizations allows you to order your AWS accounts into a hierarchy of what are called organizational units, or OUs. A single organization can hold many AWS accounts and many OUs, although a single AWS account can only be in a single organization and in a single OU at any given time. AWS Organizations lets you assign trusted access to one or more AWS services. This means those services have permission to perform actions in your organization. A single organization is automatically assigned a management account when it's created, and this account, typically the account that created the organization, is able to perform administration actions on the organization, such as creating and deleting OUs. If you want other AWS services to be able to perform such administrative actions, you can give those services delegated administrator permissions to do so. So now let's see what AWS Control Tower can do. In many ways, AWS Control Tower is a more comprehensive tool for managing multi-account AWS environments than is AWS Organizations. Although, as you'll see, it relies on AWS Organizations, so both services are crucial. AWS Control Tower centralizes an organization's account management and ensures requirements are met. AWS Control Tower automates account creation through Account Factory. Account Factory provisions needed accounts and ensures that all settings on those accounts for crucial controls, such as logging and security, are consistent. This minimizes the possibility of poorly configured accounts leading to security holes. Rules, or guardrails as they're called, are defined in AWS Control Tower to ensure compliance. Some guardrails are mandatory rules that are enforced automatically by AWS Control Tower, while others are recommendations that the organization can choose to follow or not follow. Some areas these guardrails may affect are things like how identity and access management, or IAM, are set up, or how encryption is managed. These guardrails result in a controlled and predictable governed environment. AWS Control Tower allows defining permissions through JSON policies called Service Control Policies, or SCPs. AWS Control Tower assigns SCPs to OUs within AWS organizations, which is one fundamental way that AWS Control Tower interacts with and utilizes AWS organizations under the hood. AWS Control Tower doesn't do everything internally. It actually integrates with many different AWS services to implement a homogeneous account management environment. As just mentioned, it uses AWS organizations to group accounts into OUs and assign SCPs for permission management. To make sure resource configurations meet requirements, AWS Control Tower utilizes AWS Config. AWS CloudTrail is used to monitor APIs and log details. AWS Security Hub is used to monitor alerts and compliance. And finally, going back to AWS Config, which I mentioned earlier, the rules assigned in AWS Config can automatically adjust resource configurations if they're out of compliance. AWS Control Tower orchestrates all these services to perform its functions. So to finish off, here are the steps in an example where an organization is setting up their multi-account environment using AWS Control Tower. First, they set up what's called a landing zone in AWS Control Tower. From there, they can specify what accounts they need by specifying the number of accounts needed, and AWS Control Tower will create the needed accounts. They then define the guardrails or rules that apply to those accounts, so they're created the same and follow guidelines. For permissions to resources and services, service control policies or SCPs are defined and applied to the accounts. The defined guardrails and service control policies enforce governance, or in other words, make sure the accounts meet requirements at all times. The centralized view of AWS Control Tower lets the organization see the account environment and what is happening in one consolidated place. And logging takes place via AWS CloudTrail, so when issues occur, the organization can troubleshoot what happened by looking at that API activity. AWS Control Tower works with AWS organizations and other essential services in AWS to offer organizations a complete and robust way to manage and govern their multi-AWS account environments.